Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar hosted by the Iberian Horse Alliance. Tonight's presentation, titled The Iberian, How the Horse of the Past Became the Horse of the Future, promises to be an insightful exploration of the enduring legacy and evolving role of Iberian horses. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Paul Belasik. Paul is highly respected international rider, trainer, writer, and teacher, and a passionate proponent of classical equestrian ideals. He has ridden and trained at every level of dressage, from starting young horses to Grand Prix and beyond, and is the author of 9 acclaimed books on dressage, including his latest, Long and Low, A Revolution in Modern Dressage. Graduate of Cornell University, Paul has studied under many great masters, blending classical principles with influences from Zen, Buddhism, and martial arts. Together with his wife, Rose, he operates the Pennsylvania Riding Academy at Lost Hollow Farm, offering world-class training, clinics, and short courses focused on correct position and unlocking equine potential. His lifelong involvement with Iberian breeds, including breeding Andalusians and training PRE horses, makes him uniquely qualified to illuminate this topic. Paul, thank you for joining us. We're honored to have you and look forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you. And I'm glad to do it. I'm glad you got all to think of me. I wanted to start off this talk by reading you several quotes from the 15 or 1600s. The first one is from the Duke of Newcastle in England, 1665. And he says, "The Spanish horse possesses great strength and courage, is eager to learn, and walks and trots with the most elegant and dignified movements. He has a proud gallop." Duke of Newcastle. So England, 1665. In a way, who was the Duke of Newcastle? Why was he important? Well, if we think about somebody like Guérinier, who was kind of the father of modern dressage in a way, and when you talk to anybody at the Spanish riding school, they'll say that they follow Guérinier's instruction to the letter. And when Guérinier was asked about riders who came before him, who he thought were really exceptional or whatever, he said there were only 2 really that came to mind. And one was the Duke of Newcastle, and the other was Salomon de Brou, who we'll get to now in a second. So next quote is from Salomon de Brou, 1600, from France. "Comparing the best horses, I give the Spanish horse first place for its perfection, because it is the most beautiful, noble, graceful, and courageous." All right. And as I told you, Le Brou's reputation was phenomenal. So I have another one, and now this is from Germany, from Lunason, and Lunason says, "It ought to be recognized, moreover, that of all the horses on earth, the Spanish are the most intelligent, the most likable, and the most gentle." 1558, Germany. So how did these riders really come to know the Spanish horse? And how did they come about that they're from different countries? Well, now we have to go through a little bit of history. So he takes us back to, in 1442, Naples and parts of Italy were conquered by Alfonso of Aragon. Spain had control so that Italy could serve as a military base to hold off French expansionism. And a consequence of this was that, in a sense, the creative forces of the Renaissance met the Iberian and the Spanish horse. And it was then that these riders had now a vehicle to express their creativity in this really newfound equestrian art. When Federico Grissoni was very important in his own right, in the sense that when you look at the history, like bibliophiles look at the history of writing books, there's a big gap from Xenophon in Greece all the way back to northern Italy. And Grissoni's one is one of the first ones that come up. King Duarte in Portugal, but Grissoni's comes up. And Grissoni has this quote. He says, "Once there was a time in a city in the kingdom of Naples known as Sybaris, where not only men, but also horses learn how to dance to the sound of the symphony. Now that isn't an exaggeration, because at that time, what there were human ballets and horse ballets were coming out about at the same time. They were invented at the same time. And in the 1500s, riding schools flourished. And one of the famous probably was Pignatelli's. And now we come back to my initial question as how did these riders from all over Europe end up, with this, knowing about the Spanish horse and admiring the Spanish horse so much? And partially it was because at that time, noblemen from all over Europe were sent to Pignatelli's school. There was a school, another man named Fieschi, and sometimes it's hard to tell in these historical texts, the exact spelling of their names, for example, or sometimes the exact lineage of the dates, who when they were born, when they died, so on. But there was a group of them in any way, and Pignatelli's school was probably like one of the most famous, if not the most famous. And the riders who trained at his school reads like a who's who of classical riders, of the classical masters. A man named Vargas studied there and then went on back home to Spain. Lorenzen went back home to Germany. Pluvinel to France. Served. Who does he serve? He served the King of France. Lebrun, whom we talked about a little bit, a very famous writer with a very influential book. Saint Antoine, he was from England, and then he goes on to teach the Duke of Newcastle in England. The interesting thing is, so these men all learned at this one place. They then went back home to their respective countries, and then maybe native folk traditions creeped into their riding, and it influenced the style. But there really were no national schools of riding or national styles. All those men learned from the same place. And they all really learned on these Spanish horses, and they had this great admiration for these horses. Because remember, before then, a lot of times all the only horses you had, Charlemagne and so forth, were these, big, crusade type horses. So when they saw these horses that literally could dance, it was amazing part of the culture. But that's how they became so influential. As a sidelight, it's always interesting to me that of the thousands and thousands of people who have seen the Lippes honors in Vienna, very few of them probably ever asked the question of why is this riding school in the middle of Vienna named the Spanish riding school? In the middle of Austria, how has that come about? But of course, this is the influence. What we're talking about is that the Spanish horses had made such an impression throughout the whole of Europe that they just became more and more famous, and everybody wanted to have one. Now, albeit we have to admit that this is probably more of an elite class of people, that the average person isn't going to be able to have such a quality horse. But nevertheless, that is the history. When we think about dressage, or when you're studying dressage, like I've studied, most of my life, you see that the Spanish horse, and in general, I should back off a little bit and say when we're talking about the Spanish horse too, sometimes I could just use the word Iberian, because there would be so little difference between Lusitanos and Andalusians, for example. They're pretty much genetically identical horses, but it would be like almost the German horses coming from different provinces, Hanoverian versus a Trakehner or something. So they're pretty much the same kind of horse. But so when I'm saying Spanish horses all the time, in a way, I'm meaning the Iberian Peninsula. In any case, these Spanish type horses, these Iberian horses, were the horse for dressage. And again, albeit that it was more for a privileged class. Now, in Central Europe, there was a parallel breeding and riding culture. And it stemmed initially from horses in like Hungarian, the steppes. These were more hunting type horses. And what they did was they evolved really to the modern German system. And these were crossbreds primarily used for cavalries. Early on, it became a huge industry. They were supplying those breeders that, as I say, evolved into then the German sort of breeding program, breeding stables. They were supplying horses literally all over the world for these cavalries. It was a huge business. It's important, I think, to really know, it's going to come into this talk a little bit later, but it's really important to understand that the genesis of this was this huge exportation, this really big business early on in the German, in the warm blood horses. Now, the fly in the ointment comes with the industrialization. Now, almost overnight, in a way, there is no more market for these cavalry horses. And all of the people who are involved in it, the cavalry officers, the military, essentially, they were going to be without a job. So what they did was they loved what they were doing, and they decided, and together they worked on it. People, there were very influential people like Gustav Rau, who was a dubious character, but in a sense a brilliant businessman, decides that really what we're going to have to do is we've got to get the public involved in the horses. So now, if we can't sell them to the military, we have to get the people interested in riding, and riding clubs being formed, any kind of promotion, whatever. And so they invent really what would be now the modern sport horse. And to promote this horse, what they do is they form competitions. They start 1912, the first Olympics, whatever, but there'll be equestrian competitions. And the military people are going to really control these. They know that it's going to be important for their business that their horses win these competitions, so they're going to have to control the judging, and they're going to have to control a lot of forces outside, the market. Now, that in a way is a different subject in this talk, but it's something I've written about in that new book, and I can just flash it up there, a plug for the book, but there's this Long and Low book, because that talks a little bit about how this whole how the whole story of competition began, and how the Germans how did the Germans control it, and how did the Germans, even to this day, really control and win so much. And it's not just because of superiority of their horses. It becomes really a case of really controlling the industry. Now, okay, so now I'll digress a little bit here. In the 1970s, we're going to come up to there, I was heavily involved in the German system, particularly with Trakehner horses. I was quite young, and I had met a couple that had come over from Germany, and even at that time, it seems like dark ages ago, but they shipped their breeding horses over on a boat. And I became a young trainer for them. And so I became heavily involved in the whole German system of standing stallions for them, and then helping out with obviously the breeding, and then breaking the young horses almost for stallion approval or inspections. In those times, and so on, the inspections were very similar to eventing. They had three phases: a jumping phase, a cross country phase, dressage phase, and so on. Well, my first love was always dressage, but I was eventing at the time as well. So in a way, it was a natural fit for me. But I had to really learn about the whole German system, what the rules are, the indoctrination, the language, and so forth. And I did, and I was, as I say, quite involved in it, and so on. These were primarily Trakehner horses. The godfather, probably, of the Trakehner horse is a man named Fritz Schilke. And Fritz Schilke had a famous saying, and what it was he said that no breed ever died from lack of type. Breeds of horses die from lack of marketability. Now, this is a crucial statement, I think, that really to understand the philosophy and the culture behind the whole German riding program. These breeders were going to be flexible to try to give the public what they wanted. They used many breeds. Initially, in the breeding programs, of the top 5 German horses, 3 were French stallions. Since there were heavily infusions of thoroughbred blood, there was Arab blood, harness horses, and now, very, very recently almost, they've actually allowed Iberian horses in there. But my point is that the guiding principle of this horse industry was really sales. And it wasn't really that they were going to worry about type. They were going to worry about what did the public want, and that's what they were going to give them. Now, the problem with that was often in this quest to satisfy the public, they overlooked problems of soundness or disposition, trainability, and often in the case, if they would overlook these if the stallion or the horse was really flamboyant enough. If it was really eye-catching enough, then even if these lacked disposition, they still would go with it. They still would breed it. And today we're in a sense paying the price for that. So after about a decade of being really deeply enmeshed in that whole that culture of breeding the warm bloods and the German system, I knew it kind of inside and out. And I'm not trying to condemn or really categorize that whole German program, because like in this last book that I wrote, there were really two kinds of German riders. There were classicists like Steinbeck, who to me is one of the most brilliant horsemen. And I quote him verbatim in that book because he says some amazing things that still hold up perfectly to this day about collection and so forth. And again, it was this idea of, back from the Renaissance, it was this whole thing about dressage it was important about collection, getting the horse to sit more, getting the horses off the forehand, balanced on the rear so that they could do airs above the ground, arts, or whatever. Steinbeck he was out of that mold. These other riders came strictly out of the military, and in some cases, they really didn't have a knowledge. They weren't educated in classical riding. They were just educated on a more superficial level of just riding, and they liked sports, and so they just put those two things together. Now, anyway, as I say, after about a decade or so of that, I decided I needed to see some other kinds of horses, and I was already getting the feel. My first wife at that time had gone to school in Ireland and studied with Ian Dudgeon, and at Ian Dudgeon's there was a famous, now quite a famous woman rider and trainer, and it was Sylvia Stanier. And I was reading Sylvia Stanier's classic little book on lunging, and she was talking about this guy Nuno Oliveira. And I've been hearing this name come up now over and over again from these obscure places. And I thought, well, I need to really find something out about these Iberian, these horses, and I need to see this kind of riding firsthand. I'll tell you a little sort of an anecdotal story about that. So when I decided to do this, to go to Portugal, one of my main mentors was Dr. Henry van Schaik. And van Schaik was an erudite man and a really a class act and a super person. But when he heard that I was going to do this, it was like, he's trying to talk me out of it. And I thought, he said, no, he said, I'll write you a recommendation to go to Van Nijndorf's. And I thought, no, I can't take any more of the German system. I have to see something else. And maybe that's an offshoot of my own education, more in a kind of liberal background or whatever, or more widespread kind of learning situation. Anyway, I decided to go to Portugal, and I did, and I just began to study with Nuno Oliveira. Now, that's not the story. The story is, though, that when I got there, what I really fell in love with almost immediately was these horses. I remembered from coming out of that German background and standing some of those German stallions who could be, relatively aggressive and so forth. And here I was seeing stallions stand next to each other, side by side. Nobody's biting, nobody's kicking. They all get along. And I'm thinking, like, I don't know what kind of, maybe they're just so dull, that they don't have any fight in them, whatever. But then I saw them move and I thought, well, that's ridiculous. They move unbelievable. And then I thought to myself also, the intelligence of these horses, it was clear, and especially became clear after I started to own them and breed them, how smart those horses were. And comparing them to sometimes the warm bloods, I don't want to keep making aspersions, but, nobody who's ever had an Andalusian horse has ever said it was dumb. I can tell you that, pretty much universally across the board. So in any case, when I saw the Iberian program, that I saw that their breeding programs was really governed by their own particular uses, whether it was cattle work or high school dressage or bullfighting. They didn't seem to care what the public wanted, and I didn't see any really interest whatsoever in them trying to sell horses outside their own country. And I just thought, this is really different. But the horses themselves, as I said, were quite incredible, So in a sense, what I'd come to realize in a really short time was the breeding program on the Iberian Peninsula seemed to be almost opposite of what I had been learning and been studying all the time in the German system, where the German system was less interested in type and more interested in marketability. It seemed like the Spanish breeders couldn't care less about marketability. They didn't care who bought their horses. They didn't even try to sell their horses. They just bred for this type. They wanted these horses were docile. They were, fast reflexes. They were extremely intelligent. They were very useful, and they were very sound. I think it was around this time that it was not only myself, but there were other people began having this interest in those kind of horses. And so some of the first that I can remember was Michel Henriquet in France, and his wife at the time, Catherine Duran, began competing Lusos, and they competed on the world stage and even in the Olympics. And then I think they've been started, and then also Nuno became a phenomenon. So he was garnering a lot of publicity, but the competition, they were creeping a little bit into the competition. Initially, there was a huge bias. Now, let me backtrack for a second. I hope I'll remember to come back here. But initially, when the military people made the competitions and made the rules for the competitions, Eloy Podhajski, who was involved as a Spanish riding school and very famous, whatever, had Lipa's honors, but he also had trained different horses, more warm blood types or thoroughbred types. Podhajski wanted to compete the Lipa's honors. He didn't think there was any reason why he shouldn't be able to. But when he went to compete that Lipa's honors, even though it was super trained, it was crushed. The German judges would have none of it. So they were going to they were making rules from the beginning that other breeds were not going to be able to come in their house and win at their competitions. So, and that bias lasted for a long time. So when people like Catherine Duran first brought those horses out, of course, they didn't do well in terms of placing, but they did well in terms of somehow they caught the public's eye. Now, there were more wealthy Spaniards than thought that they could really do something more on the world stage. And then we began to see some really amazing horses, and started with Invasor, Evento, horses like that. It comes later to Fuego. These were horses that the public just fell in love with. They were just so much personality. And also, you became aware of how they were bred, and how they were trained. When you go, or people go to like the Golga or the fairs in Spain, I don't mean this to come out the wrong way, but you see riders who are not the greatest riders in the world, but sipping their glasses of wine on stallions right next to the next guy on a stallion, ride them right into a bar, get a drink right out. That's a testament to what kind of animal we're talking about here. They're amazing, and I really fell in love with it. And to be honest, what I was thinking during that time was, look, this is the horse my students need to ride. My students were, predominantly women from 25 to 75, and they were riding 17-hand warm bloods, and they were getting bucked off, and there were injuries that were like frightening. And I was, when I was riding these horses in Portugal, and then when I started breeding them myself, and I thought, finally, people can get out of past second level when they have a horse like this that could do collection, it could do upper level movements, but was comfortable also to ride and so forth. So that was really my a huge interest in it, or motivation in it. I think now it brings us up more to the future, is that with this rocketing of the interest in the Spanish horse, is that I think there is a real danger that, in the sense that the breeders of the past certainly weren't interested in marketability, but it's almost as though as now today, marketability has been forced on them. These horses are too sought after. They can be so valuable that I'm just hoping that as breeders keep breeding, that they don't abandon those initial ideals. And unfortunately, I see, in some cases in South American Lusitanos and so forth, there are breeders who have abandoned really some of the classic type of the close coupled horse with super disposition, and they're trying to almost breed longer backed horses, something to compete with the warm bloods. And I'm afraid if people do that, we're going to lose the thing that for 500 years minimum, that all those famous riders I told you about loved about these horses. And that's really what I wanted. Not that I'm this great breeder, but I have been doing it for 40 years. And I want people to be careful that and still stay true to those principles. Another sideline of that is, in all of the years of staying true to that type, not only from the terms of disposition and intelligence, but it's also soundness. I've said this before, but uh, the stable we run is always, it's been similar. Now it's been over 40 years. It's really been in two locations, but it's essentially the same thing. There were approximately 15 stalls, and there's approximately 15 horses in training, and they run the gamut from horses just being broken to FEI horses. Now, I could take out the medical records, and I actually could do this. And I, in some cases, I have in the last years, and I could make a divide, two sheets of paper, and I could have the warm bloods on this side and their medical records, and I could have the Andalusians on this side and their medical records. Now, my last stallion, the stallion Excelso, 23 years old, if you want to look at his records, there's nothing on there. There is, all he has is a list of his shots from when he was a baby to when he died. There were no injuries, whatever. It was a testament to the, not in a sense to my great, care, but to the testament to how those horses genetically were bred in thrifty climates and so forth, and turned out to be very sound. On the warm blood side, I mean, I'm sorry, but it's true. There are a lot of things that go wrong with those big horses, and, that are not tough enough and so forth, and dealing with the disposition. Now, I will say, of course, there are warm blood horses that aren't like that. That are almost like the end, very smart now, especially the more modern ones can be, really good dispositions and so forth. But all I wanted to do with this talk was really to find, as I said, why this horse was such a horse of the past, why it was so sought after, and then think about now it's the same horse, but in our generation, in our time, we have the opportunity to screw this all up. And I want to just sort of have a warning that, read the history, see why these horses were so valuable, ride them yourself, and you'll know in a minute when you ride how comfortable they are and how smart they are. And then let's just try to keep, from ruining what was given to us by these, in a sense, these breeders in that, island kind of Spain and Portugal, who didn't care about marketability, but cared about breeding a really high quality horse. So, that's really all I wanted to talk about tonight. So I'm certainly willing now to try to answer any questions.
So when you stated that you haven't had any injuries, the same techniques have been applied, because I hear so much about hock injections. It's like, I don't know, everybody gets hock injections. And is that the training, or is it the horse, or is it both, in your
I think
opinion?
I think it's both, but let's say in my case, it's in a sense it's a good laboratory because it's a consistent. I trained the horses, whether they were warm bloods or whether they were Iberian horses. They trained exactly the same thing. I used the same system I've used for 50 years, and so that part was a constant. There was no variability. So no, the horses didn't. One set of horses did not hold up as well as the other set of horses with the same variables.
Hmm.
Yeah. Now, I think too, that's more in the subject too of that new book. I do think that the training systems have gone off the rails a bit, and partially they're contributing now to more injuries of horses. And if you took Iberian horses and you trained them in these long and low systems and you just did that repeatedly, maybe you would find the same things happening. But as a result, no one trained those kind of horses long and low. They were, all in Spain or Portugal, they all rode uphill. There was never that kind of training. And so maybe, it would be difficult to say, the difference between causation and correlation. But certainly, in my case, as my laboratory experiment, it was the same training, and one set of horses clearly did not hold up as well as the other.
That's a really good point. You have a very unique situation where you could test that piece out.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and so it just in a sense, it came to me in a way by accident because it's always been a small training stable, and it's maybe because I'm not inventive enough or whatever, it's always been the same. It's kind of the same business all the time. It's always been about the same number of horses in training, and also the same variation from young to old, and then a good number of each breed throughout the years.
Have you seen a drastic change in the breeding? I know that they are getting bigger to compete with the warm bloods. Is there any way for a newcomer to the breed or a new breeder coming onto the scene on how to protect the conformation of that horse? And
I think it's to just keep in mind the standard and when you read the things that it was, it's a close coupled horse. It's comfortable in the gaits. It's very intelligent, and that it says a natural ability to sit. It's very well balanced. So, those would be the things. And if you saw, let's say you don't know anything and you go to buy a specimen and they tell you it's a really great Iberian horse, but it has a really long back and it doesn't seem to have really good balance, or you wonder, I don't know how I'll ever get this horse to sit. It's probably the result of some poor breeding. And then the first place I noticed it was, and I don't mean to sort of cast aspersions, but was more South American and the Lusitanos in South America. And even I know some of my Portuguese friends were upset what was going on there because there were large breeding farms. They're breeding, hundreds of horses, and they were actually breeding them for a new market. And they were trying to breed them, deliberately trying to select for bigger ones and longer movement and so forth. And I think the result was they were moving further and further away from the type. And again, those are not all types. I'm just saying about trends that when you see them, they make you worry.
They're still doing that.
Still doing that, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, they're still doing that. They're still trying to breed that horse for American market. Which why would you change that beautiful horse?
Yes. Why would anyone? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know, other than the fact that, that the Germans did a really good job of selling their horses for competition, and that we know already there are studies that prove there is a bias toward those horses. So if you did have some, I'm not saying, suppose you did have some really interesting competition, you like competing, it's fun for you or whatever. There are a lot of people like that. Well, and you have a certain budget, whatever, you're going to try to buy a horse that's going to do well competing. Certainly even a few years ago, I would not have recommended buying an Iberian horse if that was your goal, because the judges would never have rewarded you on those horses. They'll immediately put you down. So now that's changing, but there's still a strong bias, for the warm blood horse in the competition world.
Well, that's one of the reasons that we worked on forming this Iberian Horse Alliance, was because of the bias against these horses in the bigger world. When you see, I think it was a kind of a wake-up call to the dressage industry this year when the National Dressage Pony Cup, which recognizes all breeds of horses under 16 hands. It can be a Lusitano, it can be a Lipizan, or it could be a short Andalusian, all competing, and their scores are all balanced out against each other. But the main show that they did this year, their big show, was the largest attended dressage show in the nation. And so it is, but it's everybody with these smaller horses now have a place to go with Dressage Pony Cup. And they've done a really great job of marketing and doing their reach people, and you're getting a better quality rider. Your Halflingers, your Fjords, your Lusitanos, you're getting a better quality horse, you're getting a better quality rider, in my opinion, versus what you see in the modern dressage arena, in the show ring, where it's not so stiff, it's more.
Yeah, I think anything like that is going to be valuable, to open up the public's eyes. If you never see anything different, you won't know that something could be better or someone could be doing a better job of it. So I do think it's important to have this just a wider view, and when you're looking at stuff, it's like getting more of a liberal arts education and just straight and it being an engineering degree. You're supposed to look at the broader picture, and then you can make decisions about your own personal likes and dislikes. But my feeling is it's kind of almost, I think what you're saying as well, is you should know if you're a horseman, you should know about the other breeds. You should know about the other styles of riding. Now, you can choose to do what you want to do, but you shouldn't just be able to just, rule them out as not applicable.
Something I'm curious if you've experienced that I've just witnessed is some of the Spanish breeds getting put into German style training programs
Mm-hmm.
and really not
And can
doing
you
well.
introduce yourself?
Oh, sure.
Can
Yeah.
you
Hey,
can you
yeah.
give just a little background because I think Paul will find it really interesting what you do and
Um,
what you're doing.
yeah. Well, I've been working with Rupert Isaacson, who is a student of Luis Valenza,
Mm-hmm.
and learning the classical in-hand work with my Norwegian Fjord pony, who we actually won Pony Cup quite a while, 5 years back at first level. So that's our little claim to fame. But she's a great little dressage pony, really done well with the classical in-hand work, actually, like does a little piaffe in hand and all kinds of stuff. And then I use it therapeutically. So I will teach, I have a small group at a therapeutic riding center where I teach a group of their adult clients kind of some of the basic principles of like lunging and long lining and basic in-hand work. And then we use it to rehab and condition the therapy horses too. So it's this really cool
Mm-hmm.
way of like, keeping practicing and having it help horses and people.
Yeah.
Anyways, yeah, yeah. So I'm
I'm
also a
glad.
dressage rider and I also have just got a Lusitano who I'm absolutely in love with. He's brilliant, brilliant. And have been working with him at the therapy program also. So yeah, but I have been a dressage rider for a long time, was in more of a German style program, and definitely witnessed Spanish horses being brought into that program, and they would wind up being labeled as like just too crazy or difficult or challenging because I feel like they were ridden very like forward, 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 and not really ridden in balance. And they would get bolting that, they would just not really know how to manage them. And I'm just wondering if you have seen that at all.
Yes, I think I have. I have seen that. You know, I think by now everyone knows I'm so against it that they really don't bring it up to me or whatever. But of course, I see it whenever I go out. But I think a little bit of it is just like, and for those people who you could take it even to different dog breeds or whatever. But if you take a really intelligent dog, and then you try to just browbeat it or work it into submission or tire it out, you're not going to get anywhere. And if you really just keep those kind of animals under wraps, they're going to become destructive because they're just too smart. So you can't just put them in kind of a program which just is demeaning to them or whatever. You really have to adjust a little bit and realize you're dealing with a much more intelligent animal. So a lot of times I think just what you're saying is that maybe someone could misread what we're talking about and say, "Oh, they were talking about the confirmation. They weren't ready. The confirmation was not the right, so that's why they didn't adapt to that school of riding." And I think what we're both saying is, no, that's really not the issue. The issue is that the horse didn't fit in because the horse was probably too smart or whatever, and it needed to be ridden that way in balance and so forth. But yeah.
I'd like to
Yeah,
go.
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So yeah, I do think anyway that that you can't take those intelligent horses and just put their heads down and think that you're just going to get them to submit, because these are horses, what I mean, for centuries were bullfighting horses. If you think they're afraid of anything or they're a cowardice, or they're going to give up, I mean, you're crazy. I mean, that's not going to happen.
I had a few things. You described exactly why I wanted to go get an Iberian, because I think they're a great adult amateur horse. They're calm, they're smart, they're quick off the leg. I remember being on my warm blood, and it was just, I remember my trainer saying, more leg, And I remember one, like a vice grip. He said, I can't ride like that, And so when I finally was able to purchase another horse, I definitely wanted to look at Iberians. I got, like you said, you need to see the other things. Well, we're horse poor down here in Alabama, but I did get to go to Louisiana, probably in my 20s and 30s, and I met Diana Christensen, who had trained with Nuno in Portugal when she was British, and she would go there in the summers. And she had PREs, and that's where I first got exposed to them and realized all the great qualities of them. Well, of course, my friends were like, "Why aren't you getting a warm blood?"
Mhm.
But when we started looking in 2024, my trainer was down in Florida, and I had some horses lined up for her to go see, and talking about how maybe one had not been started in the right way.
Mhm.
And she got on that horse. 2 minutes later, she got off. She said, "This is not for my client." She said his brain was just fried.
Yeah.
Yeah. And people have got to realize they don't need to be trained in that way, for sure.
Yeah.
My question is, when I first started looking, one of the insurance agents I spoke to said that her company didn't really like her insuring the Iberians because they tended to colic a lot. And that kind of got my attention, and I've never heard that. And
Yeah.
then I had to learn that, these horses can be highly susceptible to sugar and starches. And
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
so then I've had to think about how I was going to feed mine. What am I going to do with pasture? What am I going to do with hay? And I'm still trying to learn about that. What have you found works well for these horses, especially, in the Southeast?
Well, I think you pointed at problem. At first, when you said colic, I thought, that's not been my experience. But I will say my experience what is that they can be extremely easy keepers. And you have to be careful, right, for the insulin and so forth, that they are, you can't feed them like, I've had some thoroughbreds, so you could put a bucket of grain in front of them, and they would eat the whole thing and be fine, But if you do that with Iberians, they won't be able to fit out the door in a week, So I think it's really important that, you have to balance them. And I'll be honest, I'm not as up on it as I used to be, because my in this case Rose manages all that, but I've always had people, but to manage them, they feed a horse every day, so they're really careful. I just can walk in and say that one looks too fat or this one needs more food, but we have to balance the right ration. We have to make sure that the sugars and things are careful. So I will say, yes, that's a legitimate concern. You won't have spent a lot of money feeding those Iberian horses. They're pretty easy keepers, but that's almost a problem. And it may be that if you live in a lush area with a lot of good grass or whatever. I mean, it may sound cruel, but you may have to muzzle them or something, because you just can't let them eat themselves. They're used to living in an arid climate where there isn't knee deep grass like there is in Kentucky or Virginia. So yes, I think that's a legitimate concern, and you do have to be careful about the management of them in that regard.
That's one of the guest speakers we're going to have will be Mary Hartman with Stable Feed, who
Mhm.
was down with us at the Ibericon. We have this same problem with the Mustang horses too, because they eat like the Andalusians and the Lusitanos do. They live on the prairie
Yeah.
or in the desert where there's not forage. So,
Yeah.
and that's the problem. That's what we mess up our horses here.
Yeah.
It's a human problem, not a horse problem.
Yeah. And I think, like I say, it's probably more cultural. We haven't had that's we're used to different kinds of horses. Like initially when I worked with thoroughbreds, I mean they you go broke trying to feed those horses. But when my first Andalusians came, I was just amazed. My own personal mare. I mean, I don't know how that horse survives, and she's like she still has a little bit too much weight, but she eats almost nothing. So we have to be so creative about different kind of hay nets and so on to make her food last longer. But yeah, they are very easy keepers, and that's a real bonus. But you do have to be careful, when you take them out of that climate, as you said, like the wild horses who are not getting fed buckets of grain, who are foraging off of just minimal grass and so forth, and have learned to be, for generations, have just learned to be very thrifty and easy keepers. So I think that's more almost like when you see those herds of the Iberian horses out there just on dusty old ground like that, come into a big watering trough once a day to have a drink. They're really tough horses. So it's
well, the other thing I think we forget, I think that it messes, or we as the feeders of our horses, and that I didn't even take into consideration until we started to work with Mary and understand the problems that are not problems, but the way that Iberian horses and Mustangs are different. American Mustangs are different than other quarter horses and thoroughbreds, and that is that even what they graze on or what they're eating, as far as kind of the dirt, the minerals, and the supplements that they're getting out of that dirt, which is the same as a thoroughbred that's so used to getting all of those rich minerals and calcium and everything out of the grass that they eat in Kentucky. I mean, that's why people around the world come and breed race horses in Kentucky, is because of the grass and what those horses get out of their grazing. It's the same though as the ones that are eating, just grazing out in the desert, they're still getting minerals and they're still getting all kinds of supplements that I didn't even think about what they were getting until, learning that next step.
Yeah, I think that those, when you get, the sort of the whole culture of a particular breed or just a particular population, that when you transport that population to another area, you got to be careful, because you're probably going to have all kinds of, issues come up with, really. And I think we're just beginning to learn even with human beings now, there's so much research that how important is gut health as opposed to always brain health and whatever, and this kind of thing, that it's really, that's where things start. And I think it's the same with all these animals as well, so that we don't know a lot yet. We have so much to learn about how, what's involved in the food and keeping these horses healthy. And, and then we go and, let's just say, switch cultures. And now you're even making it more and more complicated. So it's good that you're having that talk. I think that's going to be really important. Yeah.
Right. No, there's so much to learn.
Yeah.
You constantly keep learning.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that was what was so interesting about your book. When we had you at the event last July, the history of what happened with dressage in the beginning made so much sense on how and why they're scoring and why they do what they do. That's your book was like a light bulb moment for me. So thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you. Yeah. For reading it, and partially, I can tell you that it's a tiny little book and so forth, but it wasn't not easy to uncover that thread of how that came about for such an important topic. You would think that, it would be easy to find, but it really wasn't. I had to do and I really got lucky with running into a couple of obscure, texts and so forth that then was illuminating that whole lineage of how that came about. But it's not a real well-known story, and it's not a story that once it gets exposed that a lot of times people like to hear. They don't want to hear it, but unfortunately it is a true story. And I just felt I had to be almost more of a journalist, and I just was going to tell that story. So anyway, I hope it does.
Well, and that's what we'll lose, the history. We can't afford to lose the history with all of this, with these horses.
No, we can't. You're right. Yeah. And
sometimes the masters leave.
Sometimes it's really upsetting to me when I'm working with young people and I mention a name, a Guernier or whatever, and they have no idea. Sometimes these are young people who are competing at the FEI, and they have no idea of history or the lineage, whatever. It's as though, how did you get to that point without learning any of that? But that's what it's become. You just become, an expert at riding in a competition, and you don't know anything about the history of it, as you just said, and it's a real problem, because it won't last if everything's done at such a superficial level. It won't last.
Right.
Well, I had that exact experience. Yeah. I did a demo of in-hand work for Lyndon Gray's Dressage for Kids program and asked them if they had heard of even Xenophon or any of the writers, and they had heard of zero.
Yeah. And that's been my experience so much, and it's disheartening to me. It's really sad, So yeah, we just
Well,
have to keep
feel
doing
like,
something.
when I was looking, and even today, just looking at people that are searching to purchase new horses, you see everybody, well, I'd like to look for a Lusitano or a PRE, but open to others. It's like they've become the it horse right now,
Mhm. Yeah,
but yet they don't know the background. They,
yeah,
they just see all these beautiful horses. People are having success with them now,
yeah.
and it's become the it horse, and that concerns me. Like for all the reasons that you talk about, you talked about the bias that they used to have. I had probably 35 years ago, a friend had some here, had probably 7 or more, a good trainer that she had brought from Portugal. Um, and he would go compete, and the breed bias was in Florida, and the breed bias was so bad, she tried cutting their manes off to lessen that. And she finally just gave up and ended up selling them all.
Yeah, I mean, I totally understand it, and it was my experience in the beginning when I first started breeding. When I first had my first Andalusian stallion, I mean, I will say I was kind of, I don't know, not very proud of it, but I crossed them on warm blood mares and thoroughbred mares because I knew the bias was so high. If you run it on a straight Iberian horse, they would see it from a mile away, and you would be, last in the class. But if I crossed them, they really couldn't tell what breed those horses were, and the scores went way up. But they were good amateur horses, so the people did well because the horses behaved and could do the test without mistakes. But it wasn't obvious that it was a different breed of horse. So and then I just thought, okay, that's enough of that. I'm not going to just kowtow to the public, to the marketability. I'm going to try to just breed a better horse.
Well, I think we're seeing some of that now with the crossing with the warm bloods.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah. I was not going to go look at a 17 hand Lusitano.
Yeah.
I'm like, that is not breed standard. Yeah. And frankly, as a 60-year-old female, I do not want to be lifting a saddle over anything that tall.
Yeah. Yeah. A funny story. I was in Scotland years and years ago, but they're very conscious of they're kind of like OSHA, the development here that, they got to protect your employees or whatever. And they had these, what I'm talking about? They had these racks in the air, and the person who was grooming had to put the saddle up on the rack, and then the rack came over because they didn't want them lifting heavy saddles. It was not good for the human being's health. So they made a mechanical device to put the saddle on. But yeah, so either that or do what you did, buy a shorter horse.
Oh, and if you do fall off, it's not as far to the ground.
Mm-hmm. You're right. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Don't you blame a lot of this, or not blame, but well, yeah, I think it is blame on the judges. I think it all goes back to, we see it, you see it in the quarter horse world. That's one of the things going around right now, is that what they call that trot, if you can even call it that, in the quarter horses, in competition world, that little thing they move, but the way they move, but it's because the judges are scoring those horses.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And, in the case of I'm not a quarter horse expert or other breeds, but in the case of dressage horses, so you look to the training program for the young judges. And so what are they weaned on? What are they trained on? They're trained on films of horses, of warm blood horses, who are, so that they're learning, really, all they're learning to do is reinforce the ideas of the older judges, and the older judges have been co-opted by the breeding system, by that breeding program. That's not just a matter of opinion for me. That's a fact. There are now studies that show that that judges consistently rewarded horses who were behind the bit more. Judges will score Iberian or warm blood horses at least two points higher over all of other breeds of horses. So there is a bias built in there, and that bias gets reinforced by the education of judges. So it's really hard because, I don't want the reputation of always being so critical of judges, but on the other hand, I'm sorry, you're part of a system that is slightly corrupt, and you can't just keep hiding your head and saying that these are scientific studies and they're not accurate or they don't mean anything. Well, if that's the way you want to be, you can be that way, but eventually it's going to catch up to you. So it is the fault of judges, but it's also it's the whole business it's a culture. I always feel like it's a culture. It's a complicated system of, breeders promoting their horses. And if you have you need this horse really promoted, you need to take this judge out to dinner. You need to wine and dine him. You need to become friends with them. If your kid wants to get on some kind of a team, whatever it is, then it'd really be important if you took some lessons from that judge. And those are it shouldn't be allowed that it's a complete conflict of interest to have a judge also be teaching or training a person who is going to come in front of them and compete. Now you can say that, of course, Paul, it's not legal, but I'm telling you, it happens all the time. So this is part of the system would have to be completely changed. But yeah, I and the little bit of that, my slant comes a little differently, is because having seen people fight and get so frustrated with that over the years and years, my feeling has always been it's sort of really more of a Zen thing. Look, just ride really well and whatever you're doing, and you'll be happier. And people, I'm telling you, people will notice it, even if the judges don't. There will people you'll be riding, and 10 years later, some kid will come up to you and say, I really saw you, and you really, it was just a pleasant. You looked like you were having so much fun, or whatever. Your horse looked happy. I don't, whatever. But I really feel that, don't worry about I keep telling them, don't worry about the ribbons. Don't worry about the competition. Just ride well. And you will be rewarded, and actually you will get rewarded as well. And people will notice it. So, it's always been my advice, and it still is my advice, worry about riding well, and the rest of the stuff will come.
Great advice. I think when the world saw at World Equestrian Games, when Totalis was there and then Fuego, and they saw the joy on that ride, on that beautiful white stallion, that still people go back to that video. I think that's when people started to make a shift to, well, why aren't these horses doing so good? In the public eye.
Yeah, I mean, I think I know that I myself look at that video all the time. We look at it, and you see right there the reaction of the audience. What's his name almost gets, he almost falls off because the crowd is thunderous, and so yes. The crowd recognized, at least, let's put it this way, even if Totilas was this great horse, but to the crowd and to the public's idea, they were at least equal. There was certainly no reason why that was any kind of a subpar performance. That was a piece of art. It was pretty much flawless. And I think they responded with that thunderous ovation and so on. So I think it's not a problem with the public. It is a problem with the judging. Yeah.
Well, I remember the Atlanta Olympics with Evento, I think was the one that was Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And I remember him getting a great reception.
Yeah. That's what I say. Yeah, they were, and that's what I was saying earlier. Is that I can't imagine what it would have been like to be, Catherine Durand or whatever, riding those first Lusitanos in those competitions, because they must have gotten really, hosed, but they stayed with it, whatever. And but then, yes, you're right. Then when it was like Vento and Vase, all of a sudden, they were really catching people's eye. These were amazing horses,
especially in the U.S., because I don't think we had been exposed to it that much.
Yeah. No. Right. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I just came back from Florida, and I had the opportunity to go to a clinic. Not going to use names, but the clinician is a current judge, and the host that was having her there regularly, knows her very well, loves her PREs, has gotten some Lusitanos as well lately, and has done very well. Her PRE does very well at Grand Prix freestyle, not so much when she's doing the special or just the regular Grand Prix. And this judge told her, I know you're competitive. I know you want to win. You're not going to win with these Iberians. You're going to have to get you a warm blood if you want to win. Yeah. And you know what? I know her a little bit. And she said, I'm sure she said, watch me, because she's gotten some warm bloods in, and they're very nice. She's got one of them for sale right now, like $350,000. And she's still got her PRE, and just watch her. I bet she will. She'll show them.
Well, that would be great, but yeah. And as I said, with the likes of that, Fuego and that performance that, we were just talking about, I mean, I don't know if you really can watch that and be critical. I'm afraid that there's nothing I can say, it's like, I don't know what to say, because.
Oh, it's sad to hear a current judge saying that about.
Yeah, yeah, it is. But it's not, it certainly isn't. I'm not surprised in any way. And I would say that it's more the norm. It's pretty much the norm. It's not the exception. It's really the norm because there still is a very strong bias,
Well, I'll just keep in mind that this is supposed to be fun and it's not about the ribbons when I start showing. But I understand a lot of the classical people are not showing because of all this.
Yeah, no,
Please stop showing.
Yeah, I think that a lot of cases, the numbers on showing and so forth are, and filling horse shows and so forth are not keep going up and up because there are a lot of people who are a bit dissatisfied with the whole thing, and even the simple fact that we're now constantly under the watchful eye for horse abuse. How did it ever come to evolve to this situation? We like our animals and so on. And this is what people now think about, horse sports, is that it's borderline abusive in every form, and everything from reiners to racing, to dressage, to jumping. This is what it's come down to, so we have almost as long a relationship with horses as we do with dogs, and I just think it's criminal that it's evolved into this state now where everybody suspects that everybody working with a horse or riding a horse is performing some form of cruelty. So we've had unfortunately some very popular and some very famous people do some very bad things and given the whole
bad things
a bad rap.
Awful things.
Yeah.
Well, I do have to say that I encourage everyone to take their horses even to local shows. My daughter went to a very, very local show with her Lusitano mare, and she was quietly standing there, and a woman came up to her and said, "Oh my gosh, your horse is the horse I've been looking for. What is she? Can you just clone her? Because, she was on the small side. She was well behaved. It was a little hunter jumper show, and she was just having fun with her mare. And she was like, wow, yeah, that's the one. So you promote these horses even at a local level. It impresses people.
Oh, I think absolutely right, and I think you're exactly right. You don't have to worry about really going to the Olympics or whatever. It's right. Just when you go out in public and everybody else is just having a rough time and they're and it just seems awful, and then someone is on this horse that's it's just pleasant, and just what you found out. People notice it. It's a huge advertisement for your horse and the breed. Yeah, I think it's really important, right? It's it's like they always say, act locally, think globally, or whatever. But it's like that's really the way it goes, Yeah.
Yep.
That's what we're trying to do, right, Susan?
Yes.
Well, yeah, I really commend you guys. I know how much work it is, to do these kind of things and these administrative things, and so much work behind the scenes and so on. So, for my part, and whenever I can help, I'm happy to do it, and I really want to thank you all for what you're doing. Because it's really important to me, So, unless I think we should, if we have maybe one last question or so, and then we could wrap it up.
I just want to say thank you very much. This has been a most enjoyable evening listening to everything you've had to say. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. So,
any other questions? Well, thank you again so much, Paul.
okay.
We look forward to more of these chats in the future and seeing more of you and reading Rose's articles that she's been reading about. So tune in with, read our newsletters, come onto our website, learn more about Iberian, all the different Iberian breeds by going onto our website. Lisa did a lot of hard work investigating all that. Encyclopedia of Iberians. I think it's important to know that it's a very big, broad category, and they're special horses, all of them.
Yeah.
And
okay. I agree. Yeah. Well, Thank you all for having me, and yeah, keep up the good work. Yeah,
Thanks.
Emily.
And
Okay.
support us by
you.
joining the alliance.
I think
Yes.
We are.
yeah, we are. We're I think yeah, we're a member. So
Well,
yeah,
I know
yeah,
you guys are, but
yeah.
She's talking to everyone
Oh yeah,
else.
you're talking to the public. Yeah, right.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, we appreciate your support and your
I'll put a little
membership.
note on Facebook or my website that I was instructed to, look, people, join the alliance. Do your part now. Come on. All right. Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you. Have a
Yeah.
nice evening, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Okay. Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night.